Good evening, everybody. I'm Kara Blond. I'm the executive for Presidential Libraries here at the National Archives. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our program this evening, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. I say presidents so often that precedents is hard to get out, which is part of our Road to Revolution program series. The Road to Revolution is a rotating exhibit that we've got in our West Rotunda Gallery on the other side of our building, commemorating our nation's 250th anniversary. The exhibit features a selection of records that highlight major milestones in the American colonist journey to independence. And our current installment includes records that are related to the First Continental Congress, which convened in Philadelphia 250 years ago this month. John Adams was a delegate from Massachusetts to that first Congress, and during the Second Continental Congress, he was a key member of the committee tasked with drafting the Declaration of Independence. He spent much of the war as a diplomat in Europe and eventually signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And after the U.S. Constitution was ratified, Adams was elected as the first vice president of the United States. And finally, as we'll learn more about this evening, he became our nation's second president. Tonight, author Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky and the Archivist of the United States, Dr. Colleen Shogan, will discuss John Adams' presidency. Dr. Chervinsky is a renowned presidential historian and executive director of the privately run George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. She's the author of the award-winning book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. And her new book, the same title as our program tonight, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic, was just released last week. Congratulations. And she'll be available for a book signing following tonight's discussion. So welcome, Dr. Chervinsky, and I'll turn things over to our Archivist of the United States, Dr. Colleen Shogan. Thanks.
Thank you, Kara. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, both here at the National Archives and then also all of our viewers online. This is a really special evening because Lindsay and I were colleagues together at the White House Historical Association. I was actually there at the first book launch, as you recall, during the pandemic. And we were also here this evening with a lot of our colleagues from the White House Historical Association, former colleagues that are here to support Lindsay in the launch of your new book. So, your first book was on George Washington and the Cabinet. The second book is on John Adams, his presidency. Now, I mean, why did you write the Adams book? Is this, because he was the next one, he's number two, or was there a different reason, another reason for writing the second book on Adams?
Well, in some ways it was because he was number two, although there will not be a number three. There will be a third book, but it will not be a Jefferson book. I will not be going in order. So what I realized once I finished up the Cabinet is Washington had created all of these really essential precedents that I think shape the presidency that we have today. But how do you get from 1796, when he announced his retirement, to 2024? And I realized that once Washington left, he was such an unusual figure in American history. He was so unparalleled in his stature, which sounds like the type of hyperbole that historians usually try and avoid, but I think is actually, in this case, really quite true, that whoever came next was going to have the impossible task of figuring out what the presidency would look like for everyone else, and how it would work, what powers would work, whether or not it would actually function. And the precedents that we talk about, that we think about, that repetition has to start somewhere. Otherwise, it's just a really interesting historic anomaly. And so I started to develop those questions about, how did this continue? Where did this continue? Why did this continue? And that is inevitably a John Adams answer.
So the title of the book, Making the Presidency, it's not creating the presidency, it's making the presidency. Tell us a little bit about that distinction. What is the line between creation and making?
Well, so many people think that the Constitution was, written in 1787 and ratified, and then it's just sort of static, and it has stayed the same. And the institutions have stayed the same. They sort of came, fully fledged out of Zeus's head like Athena, and that's what we have today. And my goal with this project was to explore all of the ways in which the presidency continued to evolve and emerge in response to a lot of the contested questions about power, who gets to use it, who gets to make decisions. And that is an ongoing evolutionary process that I would argue still continues to this day. And so it had to be a verb that demonstrated action and ongoing action to reflect that it was a constant changing process of figuring out what this institution would mean and how it would operate.
Mm-hmm. Now, Adams was George Washington's vice president, the first vice president. Did he learn a lot about being president from watching George Washington?
John Adams said that the vice presidency was the most useless office ever created by humankind, which is nicer than some of the things that other vice presidents have actually said about it. He hated it because it was forced inactivity. He sat in the Senate chambers and listened to their debates. The first year he really tried to participate, and then they told him kindly to shut his mouth. So after that, he sat there silently and didn't do anything other than occasionally cast a tie-breaking vote. And that's largely because George Washington didn't invite him to a single cabinet meeting, really kept him separate from the operation of the executive branch, which I don't necessarily blame him for, because I think this was, again, very much an ongoing evolution, and Washington was figuring out who were the advisors that he most wanted to talk to. What I do blame him for was, once it was clear that John Adams was going to be the next president, Washington didn't really give him any information about how the cabinet had worked or about how the cabinet secretaries in his administration may or may not have been up to the job.
So you write in the book that March 4th, 1797 is actually one of the most important dates in American history that doesn't get a lot of fanfare. So can you tell us why that is and what John Adams' inaugural was like?
John Adams' inauguration was the first time that power was transferred peacefully in the United States from one president to the next. And this inauguration often gets overshadowed because of what happened 4 years later when Jefferson was inaugurated as the third president and there was the first transfer from one party to the next. That was much messier, it was much more contested, and so it's kind of erased our memory of that first one. But for people living through it, they did not know what was coming next. So for them, this was the first transition. And the transitions that they had seen internationally, and they were very close observers of the international world, were the French Revolution, which was characterized by guillotines and blood literally running through the streets. And so with that image in mind, they approached this first transition with such care and detail and intentionality about making sure that it was done in the right way, that it was done peacefully, that there was symbolism that reflected the peaceful nature of it and the importance of that to the Republic. And the people there talked about, when they were writing letters home that night, about what it looked like. They talked about tears streaming down the faces of people in the room and said it was the most sublime thing that had ever happened in human history, which maybe we would consider to be a little bit of an exaggeration, but they really felt that it was this huge pivotal turning point. And all of the participants were so thoughtful about even things like, John Adams selected his suit color so that it would be different from what Washington usually wore and different from what Jefferson usually wore. And Washington was meticulous about, when he left the room after the ceremony was complete, he walked behind Adams. And it was the first time in probably 20 years he had walked behind another man outside of a room. But that symbolism was so essential. And so I think that the care that they gave to the details is what I really hope people take from that moment.
Adams moves into the executive residence in Philadelphia. The White House has not yet been completely constructed. It's in process, but it's not ready yet. And he moves in, and his wife Abigail doesn't come with him. So how does that work out? What does John Adams think about Abigail not coming immediately to Philadelphia? What was their relationship like?
Well, this is one of my favorite parts of the book, because so many people know Abigail as her Remember the Ladies letter, and that is a great letter, but it is really so average for Abigail because so much of her correspondence was extraordinary, and she was such an unbelievable political thinker and partner. Their relationship is by far, I think, the most fun part of the book, and they had agreed when he first had his inauguration that she would stay home initially because his mother was dying. And so she was going to take care of his mother, and then the following fall would come back to Philadelphia with him. And he moved into the president's house in Philadelphia. It was a mess. And he immediately started sending her these letters, pleading with her to come and be with him.
Because basically a freak out. He was
freaking out. He had a complete
yeah,
freak out.
Yeah.
Pleading in a not very dignified fashion,
right.
A not very presidential fashion, saying, I need you to come here. I can't possibly handle these details. And then she would say things like, well, okay, but your mother is dying and I'm taking care of her and I'm taking care of the house. And he would say like, but what about my feelings? Not exaggerating. But what I love about those moments is, first of all, I mean, he had such an appreciation for what she brought to his life, but he also knew he was being totally ridiculous. And so at the bottom of those letters would write, don't laugh, because it was so laughable. Mm-hmm. So that window into their relationship is so essential to understanding who he was and the whole person, which we often miss with someone like Washington because Martha burned their correspondence. But that relationship is central to the book because she was his most important advisor all the time. And his critics called her his cabinet of one, and they meant that as an insult, but it was actually the most accurate insult that has ever existed because she read all the documents. She read all of the reports he got. She knew everything that was happening. And she usually, not always, but almost always gave really good advice because she could assess exactly what people were up to and kind of cut through all the political bull in a way that very few people were capable of doing.
Thomas Jefferson enters the picture. He's the vice president because of how that worked at that period of time. He had gotten the second amount of votes, so became the vice president. So what's the relationship there between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson? Does he meet with Jefferson, welcome him in, try to figure out how they're going to work on this relationship? How does that get handled?
Well, initially, I think they both really try and handle it with an admirable attempt to create a bipartisan administration. They both conduct outreach to the other. They sort of extend these olive branches. There's the very symbolic choice of they both stay in the same hotel the night before the inauguration to kind of demonstrate that it's a united front. And that quickly collapses in a bit of a catastrophe. And I think it was partly the partisan forces at the time were really pushing them apart. Madison certainly was not encouraging Jefferson to pursue this line of thinking, but I also think that Jefferson was much more of an ideologue than Adams was. Adams was independent. It was one of the things Alexander Hamilton hated about him most, is that he could not be controlled and was not a party man. And so when Jefferson saw Adams doing things he didn't totally agree with, he really turned back towards his party and away from Adams. And so just a few months into Adams' presidency, Jefferson was meeting with the French minister who was in the United States, and there was this quasi-war going on, not a declared war, but a quasi-war between the two countries. And he said to the French minister, don't bother signing a treaty with the Adams administration. Keep doing whatever you want to do. Wait 3 years, and then I'll be in office, and you'll get a better deal. Which is pretty close to treason. Not exactly, but pretty close. So definitely like among the worst vice presidential behavior, I think, maybe ever.
Right. So the book is about, obviously, it's about John Adams, but there is a lot of Thomas Jefferson in this book. And I have to say, it is not the most flattering portrayal of Thomas Jefferson that you could read. So I'm very curious, as someone who studied early American history and presidency, has your thinking about Thomas Jefferson in the course of you writing this book, has your thinking about Jefferson changed as you went along?
I think it probably calcified. I've always...
Now, you know, he wrote the Declaration. It's right outside here. Yeah.
Yes.
Just keep that in mind.
Now, he was tapped by a very smart person to do so,
right.
John Adams. No, I mean, so he obviously was a brilliant writer. I think you would be hard-pressed if you looked at the period of time from 1775 to 1825 to find someone who had more impact certainly on the United States, if not the world. Was obviously a pivotal figure, brilliant writer. His ideas inspired generations of people to seek better conditions for themselves and their loved ones and their nation. And so I would never deny his centrality to the American story. I just don't always like him very much. And I find his Not that I find his duplicity annoying, I find his inability to acknowledge his duplicity annoying. Because if someone is a political actor and they own those political skills, then I'm like, all right, well, game recognizes game, good job, I appreciate it. But if it's someone who is such a political actor but swears that they're not political and they don't want anything to do with it, and oh, they would never engage in politics, that bothers me. Now maybe it shouldn't, and I try really hard to sort of separate those feelings from my actual writing. But if anything, this book is a demonstration of just how political he actually is and how skilled he often was at pulling those strings.
He's very slippery, right?
It's very slippery.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the presidency itself for Adams. The most important by far issue that he has to deal with in his presidency is the relationship with France, the diplomatic relationship with France. It sort of kicks off with the XYZ affair. So tell us what the XYZ affair is and how do you evaluate Adams' handling of that affair?
So I mentioned there's this quasi-war going on, and Adams had a very keen sense that war would not be particularly beneficial to the United States. It was still a new nation. It was still recovering in a lot of ways from the Revolution. It didn't have a navy or an army with which to fight, so even if it wanted to, it didn't really have the tools to do so. And so he sent a 3-person commission to France to try and negotiate a new treaty to resolve some of these tensions about the ships that were being seized and the American sailors that were being imprisoned. And when this 3-person commission arrived in France, they were met with a series of demands for really inappropriate loans, really highly corrupt bribes, and very embarrassing demands for apologies. And all of those things had to be met before they would even begin negotiations. And this was very insulting to both the commissioners and then ultimately to American honor. And when the commissioners, I'm condensing like 6 months here, but when the commissioners failed to comply with these terms, they sent dispatches back to the United States and they were eventually kicked out of France. And in the dispatches, these envoys described agents as Agent X, Agent Y, and Agent Z. There was actually an Agent W, but it doesn't quite have the same ring to it. And so when these dispatches came back, they became known as the XYZ affair. And these were the XYZ dispatches. And their response was immediate, that people were just outraged by the conduct that they were treated to in France. Congress responded by creating a naval department and a navy, which Adams thought was great. He had been asking for a navy for years and years and years and years. It was really important if you have a giant boundary that's an ocean to have something to protect it. And it also would make negotiations go better because you would be negotiating from a position of strength. They significantly expanded the army, which he did not really want. And they passed a series of bills which have been condensed in American memory, known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. I think mostly, Adams handled it about as well as he could have. He slow played the buildup of the army, which does not sound something like typically we would give a president credit for. Typically, we want the president to be supportive of the American army, but this is not the army you want. This was a very political army that was used for partisan purposes, and it was quite dangerous to civil liberties. So he tried to slow play that as much as he could, to minimize its support whenever possible, to pursue diplomacy as an ultimate way to undercut the threat of the army, build up the Navy as really good for American trade. He did not ask for the Alien and Sedition Acts. He did sign them, but he did not count votes or whip support for it. And a lot of the powers that were granted to him under some of the Alien Acts he did not use because he felt that they were inappropriate. However, he did accept some of the sedition prosecutions. He didn't speak out against them, and that is definitely a black mark on his record.
Right. So, I mean, it was from the book, I interpreted it as a fairly skillful handling with XYZ, but then as you move into the byproduct, which is the Alien and Sedition Acts, do you think that that's where Adams loses control a little bit of the situation? And also, we'll bring back Abigail. What does she think about the Alien and Sedition Acts? Is she influential in this regard?
So the real challenge with understanding how they thought about the Alien and Sedition Acts is at this point they were together. So they weren't writing letters, which is really annoying because they were way more honest with each other than they were with anyone else. Now we know from her letters to her sister that she supported the sedition bill. I think a little context here is important because at the time, there were not the same sort of jurisprudence that we have today that says, like you're not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater. So we have limitations on our First Amendment rights if they are going to provoke violence. You're not allowed to use speech that is designed to encourage violence. Those sorts of restrictions had not yet been defined, and newspapers were literally encouraging violence. And political violence had broken out in the streets. Death threats were delivered to the president's house. There was no Secret Service. There were no gates around the president's house. People could just go up to the front door. So Abigail genuinely feared for his life. And yet, she also was like, go ahead and crush them. That sounds great. So she was a little bit too enthusiastic about the sedition bill, in my humble opinion. And I find it hard to believe that she didn't influence his thinking about it because she was so persuasive and powerful. I think that for him, where he really lost control, the big break came over the army. And the challenge with the army is that most of the arch federalists, which were the extreme wing of his party, wanted to place Alexander Hamilton in control. And he wanted anyone else, because Hamilton was not to be trusted with a 50,000 person army. He wanted to march south, crush the Jeffersonian Republicans, and seize a bunch of Spanish and French territory while he was at it. So he was not to be trusted. And so what Adams did as a way to stall that process was he brought Washington back from retirement and asked him to be commander-in-chief of the army. And then he kind of got boxed into a corner when Washington threatened to resign if Hamilton was not his number 2. He couldn't say no, because if Washington resigned, then that would be the ultimate death blow to his presidency. But it was the moment that I think broke Adams from the rest of the extreme wing of the Federalist Party, and he didn't trust them again. And moving forward, those tensions got worse, and eventually they didn't trust him.
Right. So you write by 1799 that there is a faction of the Federalist Party that is, in your words, has become radicalized.
Yes.
So where does Adams fit in that sort of spectrum of the Federalist Party? And exactly what you said, does he end up really boxing himself in to the point where then he no longer can find support within the party?
So there were 2 wings of the Federalist Party. There was the more extreme wing, which tended to be concentrated in parts of New England, and then there were the more moderate Federalists, which were more like New York, Maryland, Philadelphia, some parts of Boston, but a little bit farther south. And the extreme wing of the party wanted war with France. They were using the army as basically a spoils system to build up Federalist support. They were ardently in favor of sedition prosecutions. They were highly xenophobic. So not lots of great qualities. I think Adams' judgment in this sphere was really proven out, that he was more in favor of diplomacy. He was much more pro-Navy. He was more moderate when it came to citizens and sort of crushing domestic resistance. And he did have support. They just weren't always as loud. Sometimes the more radical voices tend to be the loudest. I think that Washington allowed himself to be used to box Adams into this corner of appointing Hamilton. And from that point forward, Adams took very concrete steps he couldn't outwardly break with the army, because that would be one step too far, but to undermine its use as a political tool and to cultivate all of the evidence he could possibly find to support further engagement with diplomacy as a way to ultimately undermine these really rabid forces. And I think that as the presidency came to an end, what's really interesting is that most Americans didn't actually see Adams as the threat. They saw the arch Federalists as the threat. So long term, I think he definitely was borne out as the wiser voice, but they really took over a lot of the Federalist Party apparatus.
And he ends up firing or removing people from his cabinet. Was that an effort to distance from this arch-Federalist faction?
It was. He waited a very long time to do so, and he never really wrote down why he waited so long. It is possible that if there was going to be a war, he didn't want to cause a split in his cabinet or in his administration. It's possible that he wanted to wait until he had secured the nomination or the renomination for the Federalist Party. Whatever the reason, he took a very long time to do it. It wasn't until May of 1800 that he finally removed the secretaries, which for me at least, when I got to the point of writing that book, I was like, finally, yes, thank you.
Because they were causing all kinds of problems for him.
Yeah,
they weren't loyal to him.
They were at times outwardly insubordinate. Like it's behavior that would never be permitted today. It would have been quashed immediately. But critically, Washington had never fired a secretary. So this was a new thing. And the power was very much theoretical because the Constitution doesn't actually say anything about it. The Constitution mentions department secretaries, and that's it. And the bills that were passed by the first federal Congress to create the departments don't even mention how one is to be removed. They mention that removal is a thing, but because there wasn't agreement, they used passive voice and just kind of like get around it. And so Adams presumed he had the right to fire someone, but it was untested. And so until he did it, and until the Senate accepted it, it was very much a question mark. And I think he waited until he was sure that it would actually work.
But in 1800, Adams finally brings the diplomatic crisis with France to an end and is able to negotiate a treaty with France. Was this a significant foreign policy achievement? And why don't we ever give Adams credit for doing it?
Excellent question. We should.
It's almost forgotten, right?
It is almost forgotten, which is insane. So the Treaty of Mortefontaine, maybe that's the problem.
Maybe it's the name, yeah.
Treaty of Paris has a little bit of a better ring to it.
Yeah.
The Treaty of Mortefontaine was signed on October 3rd, 1800. A large bit of the problem was that news of it did not come back until after the election. So it did not really affect how people viewed John Adams because it had not borne out yet his savvy and his gut instinct about diplomacy. But it established peace with France. It was signed between Napoleon and the American envoys who were there. It established peace with France. We have been at peace with France since then, and it is one of the longest lasting peaceful alliances in the world. So it really should be remembered because it's really, really important. And he thought it was one of his best contributions and should be what was written on his tombstone.
Interesting. So let's talk about the lead up to the election of 1800. In the summer of 1800, Alexander Hamilton writes...
Loses it.
Yes.
He loses it.
He writes this extraordinary pamphlet about John Adams leading into this election. Why did Hamilton write this pamphlet? What was the beef in their relationship? And does this really cause, Adams to lose the election?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in the lead up to the election, Adams started talking about, he didn't call them the Arch Federalists, he called them a British faction, because that was the language that was going to be the most incendiary at the time, because most people still remembered the Revolutionary War. So to say you had a British faction who wanted to create a monarchy or be close to Great Britain was going to be quite scandalous. And Hamilton wrote Adams a number of letters saying, I've heard you have been saying this, you've been mentioning me, please give me an explanation. And Adams ignored him. Now, typically, if that happened, Alexander Hamilton would challenge someone to a duel. That was his usual MO. You can't really do that with the President of the United States. But he also could not tolerate being ignored. That was not something he was constitutionally capable of. So he sent like several letters, and when none of them were addressed, he wrote this pamphlet listing all of his grievances against Adams, including that he was too independent-minded, he was not a party man. Just lists all of these grievances, and he shared it with friends, and they said, it's a really bad idea. Don't publish it. It's a really bad idea. We agree with you, but it's a really bad idea. And he ignored them, and he published it anyway. And it was the ultimate act of projection. So he accused Adams of being vain. He accused Adams of being unstable. He accused Adams of, seeking power. And what his friends afterwards basically said was, it made you look like all of the things that you accused Adams of doing. I don't know how much of an impact it really had on the outcome of the election, because I think the Federalist Party was already so divided. As we would to use modern parlance, we would say there was an enthusiasm problem amongst Federalist voters. But if there hadn't been the 3/5 clause, Adams would have won.
It's hard to underscore how vicious this pamphlet is. Even by modern day standards, we would say this is kind of takes the cake.
Yeah, it's, people, one of the questions I often get is, how does politics compare to today? And they use different words, but they are just as awful. They attack families, they attack religion, they attack, one of the big accusations against Jefferson was that he was going to steal your Bible. So if you won, you needed to bury your Bible. If he won, you needed to bury your Bible in the backyard so it would be safe. And Adams had a hermaphroditic character, meaning he didn't have any values or principles. My favorite one was there was an accusation that Adams had sent Charles Cotesworth Pinckney to London to pick out 4 women to bring home as mistresses for 2 each of them. And Adams responded, he was like, well, where are mine? I didn't get any. The slander and the lies were not any less extreme back then.
So explain to us how the election of 1800, how it worked. I mean, how does voting work? How does the Electoral College work? It's not exactly like how we see elections today. It was kind of a drawn-out process of voting.
Yeah, this is going to sound messy, and it was, and they thought so too. So only about 13% of inhabitants in the states were permitted to vote. Mostly white men of property, although there was a small window where women of property were able to vote in New Jersey. The way the elections worked is you would vote in a series of elections. So you would vote for your state legislatures, and sometimes that was it. Your state legislature would then select the electors for the upcoming Electoral College. Other times, you would have another round of elections in which you would directly vote for the electors that you wanted to send to the Electoral College. And the way the electors worked at the time is they had previously declared as whether or not they were going to be a Jefferson elector or an Adams elector. Other states had a statewide elector thing, so you would have to fill out a ballot of all of the names of all of the electors that you wanted to have. So it was really actually a series of overlapping elections that started in the summer and ended with the Electoral College count on December 3rd. The states tried to game the system, so if you wanted a certain outcome, you would try and change how the state would decide its electors, because the states then, as they do now, have the right to determine that. They played a lot of election games in terms of trying to figure out how to get out the vote. So for example, in Virginia, the Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, had come up with a system where there would be a statewide election for electors. And at the time, your ballot had to be handwritten. But the handwriting didn't have to match between the signature and the rest of the names. Mm-hmm. So they wrote out thousands upon thousands upon thousands of the ballots with all of the Jeffersonian Republican electors, so you could just sign your name and drop it in the box. So that happened up through the course of the fall. Then when the last state, which was South Carolina, had declared its Electoral College votes on December 3rd, it became clear that Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr had tied with 73 votes apiece, because at the time, the electors cast 2 votes. They didn't cast a vote for a separate president and vice president. And so you could have the arrangement like you did in 1797, where you had John Adams and Thomas Jefferson coming into office. Or you could have an arrangement where you have the top 2 Republican candidates, but they happen to have the same number. The tie was then sent to the House of Representatives per the terms of the Constitution, but that wasn't going to happen for another 2 months. So there were 2 months where both sides could get up to all sorts of shenanigans, and they did. The Federalist parties tried to figure out how they could either push Burr into the presidency because he might be more malleable, or delay any sort of vote until after March 4th so they could put a temporary president in place and call another election. They thought up all sorts of constitutional schemes. In response, the Republican governors of Virginia and Pennsylvania had their militia waiting on the state border, ready to march into D.C. if a different president was put in place. Mobs gathered outside the Capitol as Congress was gathering in December, and they threatened to kill anyone that put a different president in place of Jefferson. And the French minister at the time wrote back to Paris and said there were 100,000 people outside the Capitol. 100,000 people wouldn't have fit in Washington, D.C., but I like that sentiment because it gets at how concerned they were about the threat of violence. On February 11th, Thomas Jefferson, as the president of the Senate, opened the results and indeed confirmed that it was a tie, and they started to cast the ballots to figure out who was going to win. The way the ballots were cast is, and this is true of today as well, each state gets 1 vote. So it doesn't matter how many seats you have in the House of Representatives. matters how many state delegations you control. Jefferson had 8 states, Burr had 6 states. You needed 9 to win. They cast 36 ballots over the next week. It wasn't until the 36th ballot that Jefferson was finally selected as the 3rd president, and that required some very important maneuvering by a couple of congressmen who most people do not remember, that were in their 30s and 40s, and they made a compromise to put the Constitution above their own political aims. That was what actually allowed this logjam to break. And then finally Jefferson was elected and had 2 weeks to figure out the White House, to write his inaugural address, and to staff his administration.
Now, but in the midst of when all this craziness is happening, you know, between the confusion with the Electoral College and what the vote's going to be in the House, Adams and Jefferson are actually executing basically a quiet transition between themselves. And you say this is actually the exemplification, for Adams at least, of extraordinary civic virtue and maybe in some ways his finest moment in the presidency. So talk to us about what is going on behind the scenes.
I think that what's so important is that the Constitution doesn't say anything about how the transition is actually supposed to look. It doesn't say anything about how people are supposed to act or behave or talk. And so the character of the transition really depends on the people who are involved in it. And as this crisis is taking place in Congress, Adams looked at the Constitution and realized that the president has no role in resolving it. And so he exercised enormous restraint when he was asked to meddle. He refused to do so. Restraint is, far less sexy than winning a civil war. It's far less exciting than winning World War II. It's not the type of thing that usually gets a monument or memorial, although there is a commission in Congress to have an Adams family memorial, which is a bipartisan effort that I support. And so he exercised restraint, and instead he had Jefferson over the White House. He expressed his belief that Jefferson was the intended choice of the American people and that he would support his presidency. Abigail met with Jefferson to show him where things were in the space and introduce him to the staff if he wanted to hire them. Once it became clear that Jefferson was the winner, Adams instructed his cabinet secretaries to work with Jefferson to give him the information he needed, basically to give him briefings long before that was required by statute. And when he finally went home, he wrote Jefferson a note that said, "Everything is peaceful here. I wish you a happy and successful administration." And that character, the way that he was defining that character, none of that was required. And yet I think it demonstrates, as you said, incredible civic virtue and sets the tone for what we want transitions to be going forward.
So our last question, before we turn this over to the audience, we welcome your questions. John Adams, you referenced sort of this famous quote that he had. He said, "I don't think that people are going to build memorials or monuments to me." But in actuality, there's only 3 Library of Congress buildings over there on Capitol Hill, and one of them is the Adams Building. There was a very extraordinarily popular HBO miniseries that everybody watched on John Adams, based upon a best-selling book that everybody read about John Adams, and now we have
hopefully another best-selling book.
Yeah, your book on John Adams, and it's gaining a lot of attention. So what do you think, when you look back on this, what do you think Adams would have made of all of this? Do you think, his legacy and how he's perceived? What do you think he would think?
I think he would be amused. And also, I think in a lot of ways not surprised, because he was a very good student of history. He and his family had a very keen sense of their role in it. They were hoarders, so they wanted to ensure that the documentation reflected their role, which I am very grateful for. But he also would be very aware that he still ranks below in the American imagination, in the American memory. He does not have a giant obelisk in the middle of the mall. He does not have a marble temple on the tidal basin, in addition to a building at the Library of Congress.
That's true.
And so I think he would both sort of like shake his fist at that and also be amused, and kind of that's exactly what he expected. What I hope people take away, if not from this talk, then from the book, is in a lot of ways John Adams was an anathema to his contemporaries, but the things that made him sometimes feel odd to them actually make him much more accessible to us. He was self-deprecating, he was funny, he was very aware of his flaws, he adored his brilliant wife. There are a lot of things about him that I think make him more modern and more accessible and helpful to us today.
That's great. Okay, thank you for sharing your book with us. We have questions here from the audience for Lindsay?
I think there's a microphone.
We have a mic for our viewers, our online viewers.
Thank you for the talk and for writing the book.
Thank you.
One thing that astonished me is all the machinations that were going on behind the scenes, both Hamilton, which were really awful, as well as on Jefferson's side. So Jefferson gets elected, and it would seem like a natural follow-up would be craziness and disaster and all these awful things happening. But somehow we had 24 years of Republican administrations where things went pretty well, except for one little war. So did they change, or did the political climate change? I was just surprised. I expected things to go poorly.
It's a great question. So we have seen, they say that that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And one of the rhymes that I see with this moment, and then perhaps in the 1850s and perhaps today, is the Federalist Party became so extreme. It became sort of a rump of itself. And a lot of the more moderate Federalists became what we would think of as independents, and then were ultimately subsumed into this very large tent, which became known as the era of good feelings, which is not to suggest that everyone got along. There were a lot of factions in the era of good feelings, but they were all sort of roughly under one party tent. And John Quincy Adams is a great example of this. He was initially a Federalist senator, and then when the Louisiana Purchase came up, he was like, well, I know it's a Republican president, but this seems like a pretty good deal, so I'm going to support it. And he then basically was kicked out of the party, and eventually became a Republican and served in a Republican cabinet and then a president. And so the party just basically became increasingly more and more and more extreme until it essentially, it flirted with secession during the War of 1812 and then dissolved. In the back here.
Thank you so much for coming out to give this talk. My question is about John Adams' mental state. So you mentioned that Hamilton was calling him unstable, and I know there was a lot of talk about that. And James McHenry, if I remember correctly, Adams lashed out at him and he resigned instead of firing him. So I was wondering, was Adams' mental health as impactful on the presidency as people said it was at the time?
It's a great question. So Adams knew that he was a little bit rash. He was prone to speaking bluntly in a way that was not always productive. And he managed that by, whenever he could with his correspondence, his written correspondence, he would edit himself. So if he had a letter that he was particularly annoyed about, he would write up to 4 responses. And he would write on the ones like, do not send. And then go a step more moderate, do not send, step more moderate. And that was how he tried to sort of temper his impulses, which we all sometimes have. We all sometimes write the angry email and then hopefully sleep on it and revise it a little bit the next day. His challenge was when he was in person and he was speaking to someone. Then it was a little bit harder to edit yourself in that way. And Hamilton had a tendency to really push his buttons because Hamilton loved to lecture him on foreign policy. And Adams was looking at this person saying, you have never been out of the country. You have never served in a diplomatic position. How dare you lecture me on this thing you know nothing about? So he definitely did push his buttons and he did have a little bit of a temper. However, Hamilton and Jefferson are 2 of the all-time greatest propagandists that the United States has ever produced. They're brilliant writers, brilliant thinkers, and really persuasive. Historians have a tendency, when they are assessing what Hamilton and Jefferson say, to take it with a grain of salt, or sometimes a bucket of salt, as appropriate, except for when they're talking about John Adams. Then they take those descriptions as completely accurate and fact at face value. And so the descriptions that we get of John Adams are often verbatim from Hamilton's writings when he's competing against him for political purposes in 1800. So I would just encourage everyone to, if you hear, if you read Hamilton say something about Adams, just think for a second about what he was trying to achieve with that description, because I think that analytical framework is always really important.
And Jefferson does a major hit job on Adams for decades later. Decades it goes on.
Decades. And people will say he wrote this description of things in 1810, and people will take that description as though that's exactly what happened in 1800. Like, first of all, there's a decade of stuff in between there, and we know that human memory is not perfect. Second, they're often very politically motivated. He's writing them for political reasons, and they have to be taken as such.
Okay. Right here? Oh, come back.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I feel like we know a lot about John Adams as a husband, but maybe not so much as a father. So we know he had a son that struggled with alcohol challenges, Susanna, the daughter, who passed away when she was young, and then John Quincy, who would later become president. We know that John Adams was away being ambassador for very long periods of time, away from his family. So just curious how any of those experiences impacted his presidency or his leadership style.
It's a great question. So his relationship with his children was complex depending on the child. John Quincy Adams spent most of his life with his father because he went to Europe with him when he was 12, and he served as his private secretary. And by that point, he spoke like at least 4 languages. If you ever want to feel really quite inadequate, I highly recommend reading John Quincy Adams' diaries because so he had a really close relationship with his father because they were together all the time, and they loved each other and they adored each other and they had a great amount of respect. And one of my favorite letters of his is when John Quincy Adams was elected president, and he wrote and he said, "I have no words." John Adams never had no words, so you can tell he had a harder time with some of his younger children because he did spend a lot more time away from them. Charles was the youngest son, and he had been with family for most of the time that Abigail and John were abroad, and that was really difficult. Thomas Boylston was the middle son. He and John were a little bit closer because he was a little bit older, and they also had a daughter who went by Nabby. He was very close with Nabby because she was older as well. The Adams family had 2 really big challenges. The first was that there was a hereditary passed down challenge with alcohol. So Charles died of alcoholism, Thomas really struggled with it, and it hit many different generations. They also had a tendency to have one son that was really extraordinary, and the others really struggled to live up to those expectations. And Thomas wrote a letter at one point where he basically said, "I know I'm not my brother. I'm never going to be my brother." And it's kind of heartbreaking. And I think Adams did his best to not put those expectations on his other sons. Abigail, however, did have very high expectations and would have been, I think, not always the easiest mother. Question here?
Right here. Go in the back.
Thanks for coming. You mentioned Briefest compromise, and I'm just curious how you want to expand on that, how that's affected our interpretation of this era. I mean, it seemed to me that if you take John's personality plus losing the election of 1800, he's just largely been seen as a man a bit out of step with the times, and yet, as you said, he should have won that election. What effect, how should we evaluate that?
It's really a great point. I think it's almost impossible for us to even think about all the ways that it influenced politics because it was so interwoven with everything. It boosted Southern population in Congress. It boosted the Southern states' power in both the House and in the Electoral College. It affected presidential elections all the way up through the Civil War. And so if we look at the list of presidents, they either come from the South or they tend to be very pro-South in their thinking about politics and about slavery especially. It also influenced things like where the capital was going to be located because Southerners wanted it closer to the South. And that influenced things like political culture because DC was a slave state or a slave city until far into the Republic. And so it's almost impossible to unpick that weave because it was so closely interwoven. I think what I hope people will take away from today is that just because a president is a one-term president doesn't mean they're a failed president. And I think his election certainly is an indication of that.
You were asked if how he would see himself now. Realistically, Jefferson famously thought we needed a revolution every X number of decades.
19 years.
The French Revolution, not a real good example of longevity for government. Do you have any thoughts as to whether Adams would have actually thought that the country would survive this long?
He did not. He might have actually hoped that the Republic would, but he did not think the Constitution would. I don't think that any of the framers thought not that he was at the Constitutional Convention, but I don't think anyone at that period of time really thought the Constitution would last this long. But that was because they saw it for what it was, which was a series of compromises designed to secure enough people signed it and enough states ratified it such that it could form a firm foundation for the nation upon which future generations could build. And so he fully expected that there might be additional constitutions. There certainly would be a lot of amendments. They all talked about the importance of amendments, including Washington on his way home from the convention. But I also think he would be, while I think he would be disappointed that we have allowed ourselves to kind of fall into a place where we are not able to amend and improve, even if we see challenges that need to be addressed, he would be enormously pleased that it still survives.
Good evening. I'm going to read a question from our virtual audience since this event is being live streamed. Did Adams have the power of executive order? If so, did he use it? If not, do you think he wished that he did?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So they didn't really call it executive orders at the time. That phrase comes much later. And presidents at the time, well, they sort of did things that we might classify as executive orders, even if they didn't call them as such. So, for example, George Washington was the first to assert executive privilege. That's not really an executive order, but it also doesn't exist in the Constitution, and he kind of created it from wholesale cloth. Adams certainly, I think, embraced as many of the executive powers as he could, but he also very much believed in the importance of legislation and Congress serving as an equal partner in governing. So I think generally that generation of leaders would have been uncomfortable with president through only executive order because that would have not been representative of the people as they envisioned.
I mean, you talked earlier about the removal power, and that's extraordinary because if there's not a precedent of removal power for the executive or for the president, then that really, that incredibly hampers the ability of the executive to have control over the departments and how that's run. So
it basically, it would have created a executive by governing committee, not unlike the British cabinet, where all of the cabinet secretaries have a share in the power. The prime minister is not supreme over all of them, and that's what it would have created, and that's what some of the secretaries wanted to create, and he really fought against.
Right.
We have another question from our virtual audience. Why, as you mentioned, do you think the Alien and Sedition Acts are so little referred to now?
Well, I guess I'm not sure that they are so little referred to now. Usually if I say I wrote a book on John Adams, people say, how can you possibly defend the Alien and Sedition Acts? So that's usually the first thing that people say. I think that in a lot of periods of crisis, there have been sedition bills, including World War II, World War I, Civil War. And so there is sort of, I think, a recognized principle that sometimes in moments of crisis, we have to slightly curtail certain rights. We often go way too far, and those moments are dark periods, which hopefully we can learn from, but we don't necessarily want to celebrate.
Other questions? Matt?
So one of the things I've always wondered about this transition is why doesn't John Adams stick around? And I've heard many different arguments. So I was curious if, while you were doing your research, if you found anything different, or what is your conclusion about why John doesn't stick around?
For the inauguration?
Yes.
Jefferson's inauguration.
So I'm going to trust that you are all sophisticated enough to hold two complex thoughts in your head at one time. The first is, there's no doubt that John Adams was bitter about losing. He was mourning his son Charles. He wanted to go home. However, second thought is, the practice of a defeated president attending an inauguration was not started until 1845. There was no state precedent of it. Jefferson did not invite him, did not tell him he wanted him there. And the election and the transition had come so near to being a total violent catastrophe that I think John Adams was worried that his presence might be a distraction. It might somehow take away from the clean slate that Jefferson was trying to bring to the office, to detract from this new administration. And he didn't want to do anything that would tarnish that or turn it into a circus. And so he left at 4:30 in the morning. He got into a public coach. So he came into the presidency in a private carriage. He left in a public coach, which was an incredibly important symbolic gesture that he was just an average citizen. Now, unfortunately for him, sitting across the coach was Theodore Sedgwick, who was one of his enemies in the Federalist Party. So that must have been a very uncomfortable coach ride. But I think that it was both. He didn't want to be there, obviously. Does anyone really like losing? I don't think that he wanted to be there, but I also think that he did have higher motives of not wanting in any way to detract from Jefferson starting a new term.
Jim?
We've been here an hour.
Microphone.
So we've been here an hour, and we're talking about the early 19th century, and I don't think I've heard the word slavery.
Well, I mentioned three-fifths clause.
Right, the three-fifths clause, but not the word slavery.
Okay.
So, which first of all takes me aback, that we've had all this conversation about this period and the word slavery hasn't been mentioned. What did he think of slavery? The only two presidents, first seven, the only two presidents who don't own slaves are named Adams, and they both get only 4 years. What did he think of slavery? And what did he do about it?
So the entire Adams family, at least up until after John Quincy Adams' presidency, when he returned to Congress, objected to slavery as a moral ill, objected to slavery as a political system because of the power it did give to the South, because of the undue influence it had in Congress. But they did not necessarily believe in abolition per se. Their lives were, when they were in Philadelphia and they were in DC, they were very interwoven with slavery. So for example, when the president's house was in Philadelphia and John Adams was vice president, he would go over to Washington's residence. His coat would probably be taken from an enslaved valet. He would probably be brought food and drink by an enslaved servant. And so he benefited in a daily way from that labor. When he was president, Abigail had both free white and free black servants that she hired for the house, as well as enslaved individuals that she hired out from local families, which was a common practice in places like Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. It was also true of their staff in the White House. They believed that slavery degraded both the enslaved and the enslaver, and said as much quite openly in their letters. On the other hand, they had a young man named James who was a free man in Massachusetts. He was a teenager when John was president. He worked and lived in their Quincy, Massachusetts house. And Abigail firmly believed that everyone needed an education, because if you were not going to be educated, then you were not going to be able to be a productive human. And she sent James to the local school, and the local families and the teacher objected because they didn't want him in the classroom. And she went to war with the local community, and she won. And she insisted that he be educated in the same classroom as the white children in the town. So on one hand, they had ideas that often felt very out of place for a 21st century world, and other times they exhibited thinking that we feel is much more modern.
One last question.
Hi. It strikes me that John Adams also set another important precedent for the presidency that has kind of a mixed legacy. He's the first president to employ military force against a foreign adversary without seeking a declaration of war, the quasi-war against France. Was he conflicted about that? Was he worried about that it would set a possible precedent, and that it was, in a sense, sort of bypassing the Constitution, which was pretty clear about needing to seek the consent of Congress for a declaration of war?
So I'm not sure I would totally agree with the characterization, because Washington technically sent the army to battle Native American nations in the West, which were considered foreign adversaries. And when John Adams did authorize the Navy to take action against French ships, it was always in defensive posture. So they were not permitted, they were never authorized to take offensive action against French ships for exactly that reason, because there was not a declaration. And so they could protect American ships against depredations. If privateers came towards American ships, they could capture them. But he was not ever authorizing a full-on offensive naval operation because there had been no congressional delegation or declaration. That particular honorific belongs to Thomas Jefferson, who did send the Navy into Tripoli without a congressional declaration.
Thank you so much for spending this evening with us. The book is Making the Presidency. I recommend it to everyone, and Lindsay's going to be selling and signing books right outside. So, we served it right up for you. So thank you so much, Lindsay. And so I've been here for book 1, book 2, so I hope I will be here for book 3.
Absolutely.
Okay,
can't wait.
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.